Welcome, everyone. We're glad you've joined us for this NEXUS Gains Talk. We're this the NEXUS Gains program has been having a regular series of talks about the various aspects of this nexus between uh, food, water, energy, and ecosystems. In this case, we're talking about the culmination of some work that we've been doing on groundwater governance, where we have been originally took on the challenge of how do we address the problems of groundwater. One of the early ideas was to come up with a toolkit of approaches. As we've dug into this some more, we have learned a lot, and a lot of this is represented in a special issue of the International Journal of the Commons that's available open access, that covers many of these aspects. What we're going to do today is give you a small snapshot of some of the key ideas out of this that hopefully will induce you to explore in more depth in some of the papers that are all in this special issue. I am Ruth Meinzendick, Senior Research Fellow at International Food Policy Research Institute, and I've been the lead for this work package in NEXUS Gains. We have a really exciting set of presenters here. Ritu Sunil, who is Senior Project Manager at Foundation for Ecological Security in India. We'll talk about some of the work on groundwater games and other tools. Margrethe Zwarteveen, Professor of Water Governance at IHE Delft Institute for Water Education. We'll talk about how CARE can expand and transform water governance. Brian Bruns, independent researcher and consultant in Greenbelt, Maryland, and the co-editor with me of this special issue. We'll talk about governing aquifer storage for NEXUS Gains. And then after those four very brief presentations, we'll have a panel with two people who've done a lot of work in these areas and will give some reflections on, first of all, Hagar El-Didi, Senior Research Analyst at International Policy Research Institute, and then Alvar Closas, International Consultant in Bogota, Colombia. After that, we have time for a Q&A and discussion with all of you, because if you've joined, you probably have some insights on this topic. So please put your comments in the Q&A session. But for the first little bit, as you may have seen, if you have the chat open, we welcome you to put in who you are, and just so we have some idea of who's attending, and you can see who else is in the audience. So without further ado, in the interest of time, I like to get started with the first presentation. So what I'm going to be talking about is the framing of a framing that we found in the discuss in the editorial of this special issue about knowledge, motivation, and agency. First of all, why is groundwater governance important? Well, groundwater is a classic common pool resource. That means it's subtractable, it's hard to exclude people from it, but it's also invisible and fugitive. It moves around. So it's really challenging to govern. There are lots of tools for groundwater governance, but not a lot of examples of success. And we see in many places in the world either depletion or rising water tables that are causing waterlogging and salinity. We see groundwater quality problems. And because of these challenges, we need governance institutions that will coordinate across actors. So a lot of times groundwater problems are called wicked problems. They're really complex, contradictory, resistant to resolution. So we don't promise a solution to all of this, but we think that the thinking about knowledge, motivation, and agency can help. Instead of starting with tools, start with identifying who are those key actors. Then consider what they need in terms of knowledge, motivation, and agency, and what kinds of combinations of tools will help equip them. Knowledge, we mean the ability to use information strategically to achieve one's objectives. It shapes how people understand their situation. And in groundwater, that's really important because we can't see it. So that takes data that needs to be organized and to create information. Information has to be analyzed, interpreted, and shared with key actors to become knowledge. And so here you see people collecting the data, modeling it, and sharing it to be used. Motivation is the desire to act in service of a goal. And we often think about it in terms of water users, but also it applies to government, people, and other actors. Often we focus on external motivation, either incentives in terms of regulation, which is the fear of punishment if you don't abide by the rules, or economic incentives. But I think what we'll hear today is that these internal motivations can also be important. Care and other norms can shape this. So question is, how can you appeal to or strengthen those internal motivations? Agency, finally, is mechanisms for action. Can you act to produce desired outcomes, shaping biophysical and social conditions, including how you influence others' behavior? So what that really means is if you know something about groundwater and are motivated to do it, what can you actually do? Now, because of the groundwater is a common pool resource, coordinated action is required. So agency is always relational. Power relations and structures can limit what people can do. So in terms of a toolbox, you start with the key actors, and there are lots of tools out there, but they need to be contextualized and adapted to each context and combined.
Okay, Ruth, if you can be wrapping up.
Yep.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. We have examples of how we've been applying this in Pakistan. In terms of looking at how groundwater management information systems can be used, and but they need to be combined with mechanisms for action. There's some resources available in these slides, which will be shared with everybody at the end of this. And we hope that we'll have time for more discussion at the end. With that, I will turn this over to Ritu to talk in more detail about some of these tools. Ritu, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ruth. I'm just sharing my screen. Yeah. Hope my presentation is visible. Hi. Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm Ritu Sanal. I'm with Foundation for Ecological Security. So FES is an organization based in India, and we work on strengthening collective action around commons, such as water, forest, other natural resource systems. So my presentation will focus on sharing our experiences on combining some tools and approaches for water governance, especially focusing on groundwater games and the other tools that we use at the community level. So this was one of the articles that came in the IGC special issue. Now moving on. Yeah. As you are all aware that India is one of the largest groundwater user in the world, and 80% of India's irrigation is dependent on groundwater. And at the core of this issue is it's a governance challenge. And as an organization that has been working on these areas with the communities at semi-arid regions across different geographies, so we have been collaborating with a lot of universities and research institutes and other NGOs on developing some sort of tools and approaches on how we can respond to some of these issues. So this IGC edition paper that looks at which are the actors at different levels, at the local level, the community, the farmers, the local state, and at the higher level, if you look at the bureaucracy and other policy actors, which are the actors that requires change, and which combination of rules, which combination of tools and methods and approaches can influence which of these actors and what outcome it can be. So those who are interested can definitely go and read this paper. But here in this presentation, I'll be focusing on this particular section where we are talking at the community level, how we are using a combination of water games and other approaches, to trigger discussions around it. So now, so what are water games? The concept is, so it's an experiential learning, which is like you learn by doing. So the games are like structured spaces where the communities can learn, reflect, discuss, and experiment. So, so in the game, the communities, the people who participate in the game can visualize what is their impact on the resource at the long term, water as a shared resource, and how why there is a need to come together or to arrest the depletion. So in a way that the games are like can shape the mental modes. It can help in understanding the relationship between socio-economic resource systems and ecological resource systems, and it can it can make it can reveal why it is important to have some sort of mechanism to some rules and norms for managing the water resources. And I'm just briefly explaining how the game is played. So if you look at so it is played with a group of 5 people and played separately with men and women. And the players have to choose between a water efficient crop and a water intensive crop. And what you see here is that crop that we use to play the game, and you can see a scale there. So that shows the water scale, and that is the groundwater that the farmers have. So now the game will proceed based on what crop the farmers choose. If it's a water intensive crop, it's a water efficient crop, and the groundwater will go up and down based on that. And they will be able to see what is their impact, what their action on the system can impact the system at the long run. And the games are associated with followed by community debriefings, which are like sort of like village meetings, where we are inviting not only the players but also the entire village. And you are asked, the facilitator would ask to reflect on what are the reflections from the game, and taking and connecting it to the larger issues, water issues in the village. And the idea is,
I think you'll have to go quickly to show some of the other tools, because you got 1 more minute.
Yeah, sure. And the idea is not to come to prescribe any solutions, but encouraging the communities to understand the problem and come to their own solutions. And this is followed by a crop water budgeting, which I think everyone is aware about it. We talk about shared understanding of water availability and the water demand, and collectively arriving at a water balance so that they can better plan their cropping. And this is again combined with capacity building training on different crop varieties, water saving techniques, etc. And now, so when you're talking about a village, so everything is a complex system. So now in a complex system, different things are interrelated. So again, this is system thinking is something that we use to connect the water, the forest, the farm, and the people's institutions, and how the components of the system, how all of these components are interlinked, and how what causes what. So this kind of thinking also helps in planning at the community level. When you plan for structures, and when you plan for the supply side. And now when you talk about what are the responses of the community, so our approach and our village. So when we work in the villages, these are some of the discussions that take place. So the community say, okay, now we need to place a ban on borewells, or maybe we have to come up with crop sharing arrangement, things like that.
So I think we won't have time
the
to
last
get.
slide.
Oh yeah, this is the last one.
This is my last slide. And now connecting it back to Ruth's framework of knowledge, motivation, and agency. So you can see that the water gains and the debriefing, as I also said, so it's contributing to the knowledge about systems, interlinkages, relationships, and it's also, in a way, motivating, people to act on it. So it's not just the gain. So it's a combination of the tools that appeal to knowledge, motivation, and agency that can actually, yield some results. Yeah. So I think, and that's it. That's my time. Thanks.
Thanks very much. That gives great examples of how this plays out. Margaret, let's hear some of the your experiences in this from your article in the special issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. I hope I'm audible and that my presentation is visible. Good. What I will do is question a bit the tools and mechanisms that have so far been used to regulate and govern groundwater. My argument is that many of those have been focusing on the individual behavior of farmers, saying that the individuals pump too much, which is implicitly a tragedy of the commons reasoning. And what we did, I was coordinating a large project. What we did in the project was to look at mobilize initiatives of people who actually try to do something about groundwater depletion themselves. And we experimented with a conceptual vocabulary of care to see whether this vocabulary could be used to complement or perhaps challenge the prevailing language of control that we think is dominant in groundwater governance, language, and scholarship. So what is caring for groundwater? We didn't want to define it before exploring what it might be. So we used a very wide and open definition that allowed us to go out and see and find out what caring could mean in a diverse range of places. So it is an emotional engagement, a concern, combined with a practical engagement of wanting to contribute to restore groundwater quantities or qualities. So what does foregrounding care, what does it help do? I'm trying to be, what does it help do? For one, it shows that many irrigators actually are concerned about the depletion of the aquifer on which they depend, even when their own pumping behaviors are partly to blame. So they don't over-extract because of ignorance or greed, but they over-extract because they are pressurized to do so. They are in a political economy that is actually pressurizing to use more groundwater than is ecologically wise or just. And that, I think, is an important conclusion and not a very novel conclusion of our research, which I think leads to the conclusion that unless the governance of groundwater is part of a wider politics of transformation, it will be unsuccessful. A second thing that we found in our studies is that groundwater care often emerges because of people's strong sense of territorial belonging. Caring for groundwater, it's connecting to places, to waters, and to other people. And it's often through financial and labor contributions to maintaining and governing shared water systems. Irrigators, together with the allies, almost literally construct and keep alive their attachments to one another, as well as to the aquifers on which they depend. And caring groundwater inevitably also entails the crafting of agreements and rules or institutions for sharing groundwater. And these institutions are never innocent or politically neutral. So what more emphasis on caring and care for groundwater can be useful, we argue, in complementing or perhaps sometimes challenging the current emphasis on control in attempts to understand, improve, and regulate groundwater. Our stories of groundwater show that in practice, governing groundwater always requires the flexibility to deal with changes in availabilities, qualities, needs, context that are often difficult to precisely predict and anticipate. Often groundwater governance happens in the absence of precise data about qualities and quantities. This means that attuned attentiveness may be as important as rigorously setting and enforcing predefined extraction targets when governing groundwater. And such attentiveness comes with intimate and embodied encounters with aquifers, wells, pumps. And acknowledging that this is so means that other than scientific forms of expertise and skills become important. It also means that the search for generalizable codes, rules, models, tools, or technologies to do groundwater needs to be complemented with attentiveness to the processes that are always needed to translate and adapt these to diverse and changing contexts and circumstances.
Thank you very
I'm almost done, Ruth. I'm almost done. So what this also means, if we take this seriously, it does mean a rethinking of the role of outside experts or advisors. It's not us bringing knowledge or expertise or tools to irrigators or groundwater users out there, but it really is also a plea for more long-term collaborations and joint learning. And I will just say that our plea for foregrounding care and caring, we do not propose care either as a political program or as a new theoretical framework. It's just I would say it's an analytical political sensibility, helping to see what existing frameworks for governance make invisible.
Thank you, Margaret. And there's a lot more in your paper as well that I recommend people to look at. Brian, would you like to present then? Thank you.
Yes, good. Thank you. Are you seeing full screen and hearing me?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Thanks. So want to briefly summarize one of the points relevant to this larger project of looking at the linkages between food, water, energy, and ecosystems, and to say what we feel we've done is one of the things is to identify 3 key areas where governance could make a big difference. One of those is solar energy, where, as most of you are probably aware and concerned, there's a whole lot of potential and promise for what solar energy could do in terms of making power for pumping more accessible and available, as well as climate benefits and so on. But the challenge of how to do that in a way that, provides net benefits and considers the whole nexus of changes, because pumping more water inherently takes water away from someplace else, including springs, domestic wells, downstream base flows, and risks losses, which could offset or in some cases be even worse than the initial benefits. And the constructive approach to that is to say, in addition to providing support to promote solar pumps and linked access to markets, to package that proactively with ways to help develop understanding, get people involved in monitoring the resource, and have the institutions available. So if problems show up, there are ways to respond, not just to say, oh, there's lots of groundwater there. Someday there might be a shortage. We'll deal with that then. But from the beginning, to help people aware, because those problems are going to show up sooner and more severely in some cases, and often for people who are particularly vulnerable, and for ecosystems, and to package that as part of the support. The second part of this is in terms of groundwater recharge, that there's opportunities to enhance groundwater recharge, including in response to climate change, where rainfall may become more intense and more runoff unless you do something about it. There are also impacts of things done primarily for watershed conservation, but do increase groundwater. But what seems not to get the attention it deserves is the opportunity in planning recharge to think about that as an opportunity to try and make sure those benefits will be available and that they will be widely shared. I could say lots more about that. Where am I on time, Ruth?
2.5 minutes.
To go.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. So the third area is in terms of including ecosystems, because they're often left out or sometimes some kind of somewhat arbitrary, maybe 10% of some stream flow somewhere should be protected, but in ways that don't really recognize the importance of groundwater dependent ecosystems, including for people's nutrition, gathering medicines, their livelihoods for materials they use for weaving and other uses, and that those ecosystems also impacts on those ecosystems often happen the same way that their impacts on springs and shallow wells, which are crucial for domestic supply. So again, kind of like the first point, the value of being proactive to pay attention to impacts on ecosystems, thinking about the trade-offs. This is not an argument to, never drain a wetland, never dry up a spring, but to think about if that's going to happen, who's going to be affected? Are there ways to mitigate that? Are you going to make sure everyone, including the poorest people who may not have recognized social status in the community somehow, that they'll still have access to drinking water? That people who are depending on, wetlands or floodplains or whatever, and if that's going to change, are there ways to minimize or mitigate those kind of impacts? And a third point is to say, in terms of getting attention to this, one way to think about it is to particularly look at springs where FES and also in another organization in India, Aquadam and others have done interesting things trying to understand springs and spring sheds and how they can be better managed. Pay attention to shallow domestic wells, which was an issue for some of the work we did in Nepal, including using the groundwater gains that Ritu talked about. And to think about the wetlands and where people are concerned about birds and other species in wetlands. Just like in conservation, we talk about charismatic species, tigers, elephants, butterflies, what have you, that get attention. Springs, domestic wells, and wetlands can be a way to help people pay more attention and take more seriously. Okay, and I'm going to go basically just put this up here as a basis for Q&A to say we can think about water coming in, water going out, but the importance of thinking about the stocks of groundwater and the many ways in which, if those water level tables drop, can have serious impacts that need to be considered. And I think I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. We've given a lot to chew on, and before to open the discussion, I'd like to invite our panelists. Hagar, do you want to begin with some reflections?
Sure. Yes, thank you very much. I think this has been very rich. It's great to see those pieces connecting together. I mean, especially having been involved in the games and in this work for a while, I feel looking at this together makes a lot of sense. Putting those in a framework, I think, has been very valuable with your article, Ruth and Brian. It's sort of like looking at the tools like the games, creating the motivation, and then giving some knowledge, and also creating an environment of empathy a little bit for the other, which then helps to increase this care for natural resources. And I really like this idea. When we adapted the games, the groundwater game for Ethiopia, for Ghana, we played those games, and after that, people kept saying things like, we need to conserve water for our children or for the future generations. And that shows that they already think about that in that caring way. And this idea of care that Margaret brings really resonates with me, not just with the games, but also understanding that communities or like the depleters do care, and we take that assumption with whatever work we do going forward. Earlier, I did research in Egypt on groundwater sharing and giving irrigation in charity. And the notion there was very much water is a gift of God. We cannot withhold it from others in need. So they drill wells that are for anyone in need of irrigation to use with their pumps and irrigate their fields if there's like a shortage in surface water. So that really shows how communities work with this, and it's not just the framing that we think of. But I would like to come back to this point on motivation from the framework. I mean, when we applied those groundwater games in Ethiopia and Ghana, we could really see a difference, I think, in the motivation and the knowledge and the agency even than, say, with the Indian case. The groundwater irrigation there is still expanding without a very long history with communities. So on the one hand, the scarcity is not yet that high to perhaps to motivate like active action or collective action with rules and that sort of thing. But on the other hand, it's also a good time to raise more awareness about the shared nature of the groundwater, and hopefully at sort of an inflection point to induce collective action before reaching those critical depletion levels that we see in other places, like Brian was saying, like just not wait for the last minute. But these communities, when we played the game, the learning was very significant, I think. The immediate shifts in the mental models before and after learning the game, like, oh, groundwater is depletable, it's actually a shared resource, my use affects others, this kind of thing. And that we can do something about it. But then the adoption of the rules at the community level didn't yet happen, perhaps because it also takes a long time, but perhaps it wasn't that urgent, or they lack the other sorts of things like the knowledge or the agency to act in a way that they would feel comfortable with, that they're doing the right decision. And I like how Richu concluded that those combination of tools is what contributes to the knowledge motivation agency. It's really a package. I like to think about it that way. And we've been learning that over and over, especially in adapting the games and those in Ethiopia and Ghana. We lacked having such a package. We lacked having the bigger institutions to move this forward, to take the brainstorming of the communities and to equip them with more precise knowledge that's local to their area and the agency based on like their proposed and homegrown solutions. But then also it was just like planting the seed of awareness. So I think it's important to think about how we embed those tools in larger packages and long-term interventions to capitalize on these aspects of knowledge and motivation and agency. And ideally, putting those tools and those games as part of something like extension programs or long-term programs with presence on the ground, like in the case of FES, and would help avoid issues like literal learning, which we've seen, or unanswered questions, like what happens after endline, sort of, and having a continued dialogue with communities, and not beyond just a one-time game or one-time debriefing. And we saw that in endlines, communities asking about their groundwater levels or the government or someone to help them formulate the right rules or the right crops. And that would be different from place to place. We learned in Ghana, for example, that it would be good to involve community leaders in setting the norms, setting the rules for groundwater if they would like to do something about it, because that's a big part of the culture that would enable them to act collectively and like be okay with the rules that come up. So it's that long-term engagement that makes it part of the package, and also even ties to Brian's point at the end, like directing, also brainstorming towards ideas of water provision and not just water demand, which the games talk about a lot. I'll leave it here and hope to have stirred some.
Great. Thank you very much. Really appreciate those reflections from your experiences in this. And Alvar, a lot of our work built on some of your earlier work, and so we'd appreciate your reflections on all of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth, and thanks everyone for joining and for having me. I had a quick slide that perhaps someone can upload. If not, I'll start talking anyway. So I have, I think, four major themes that I've sort of gonna developed quickly to tease the discussion and to tease our panel, our presenters and audience. And I'm going to build on some of the points that Hagar just made just now. I think this is a fascinating time, at least for me, to understand and to see new ideas coming up into the scene of what is groundwater governance, how can we understand groundwater governance, and also what can we do with such knowledge and research. For me, as I said, it's very interesting, as I think we need new ways of thinking and understanding groundwater governance, not on the sort of more intellectual, for our own pleasure and intellectual and research curiosity, but it is time to move forward and to move beyond this first generation of groundwater governance, if you want, towards a second stage where we actually think of how to apply the knowledge we generate, how to action upon it, how to implement it, and also how to make it relevant for decision makers. And so we need to respond to a real demand for what can we do with groundwater governance? How can we help decision makers, practitioners do something with the knowledge that we generate? So I think the discussion and the content of this presentations and papers is extremely illuminating, at least for me. But I would urge everyone to think beyond the mere intellectual sort of curiosity and think, as I said, into this, how to apply the research you are actually developing. Because I think practitioners don't, in my experience, having worked with government, practitioners don't really stop and think about governance and what it means to them. They sort of leave it every day. I think it's part of their bounded rationality, and it is a given for them. So we need to find a new way to approach them and to show how groundwater governance, research on groundwater governance is relevant and should be relevant for them. And so this links with my second point, which is this is not a game. So we need to take games seriously. I think we're moved beyond that first generation research on groundwater games or on any sort of games where the mere intellectual curiosity and the whole point of the exercise was to develop a game. I'm really excited to see people taking games much further than that now. I'm really thinking about how games are catalyzers of a much wider impact and change within the project themselves, but also thinking beyond the project themselves, and how games, as Hagar was saying, they're part of a package, they're part of this toolbox that we really need to put forward as a comprehensive approach to developing and understanding groundwater governance. So research presented has showed us how to start thinking about scaling up games and where can the game takes us. And I find it very, very interesting and a really exciting avenue going forward. And this thinking about games also takes me to my third point, which is compliance, enforcement and incentives. Research presented has showed us that incentives for rule compliance might be elsewhere, and the traditional understanding of rules and how to apply them sometimes or very often fails. So we need to think about how to engage participants, stakeholders, and how to convince them and convene them under a new set of incentives. Brian alluded at solar and some of the work that IMI has done in India, generating new incentives, economic incentives for revenue generation based on solar might work, but then we need to look at the consequences of those in terms of groundwater depletion and groundwater consumption behavior. So I think this thinking about rule compliance and incentives leads me to my fourth point, which is about caring. I'm very excited to see this new concept of care coming up in the literature, coming up in our thinking about groundwater governance. I think it's a fascinating starting point, but that could take us into a new direction, perhaps, on understanding our relationship as human beings with nature, and make linkages with this wider frame set of incentives and nature. I would urge Marguerite and anyone interested in this topic to look at what Australia has done. The concept of caring for country is a principal concept that has been developed over 60,000 years by Aboriginal peoples and Aboriginal nations. And it's not only a conceptual framework, it's also a very much applied day-to-day focus and principle to manage nature and natural resources. So there's a lot of work done there. I think it's a fascinating approach to understand, as I said, our relationship with nature. It brings generational knowledge together with cultural values, acknowledging responsibility, ethics, stories, resources, and values that basically would take us forward in, as I said, into a new sort of way of approaching how we developed formal and informal institutions, and how we instrumentalize this concept in a very applied way. And I think, as I said, the example of Australia would be a really interesting one to try and merge these different approaches into something new. I'm going to leave it there, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for sharing all these insights. I know that we have a lot of interesting and interested people in the audience, and so I'm going to turn this over to Brian to facilitate the discussion and the perhaps starting with the Q&A, but then with some of the open discussion. So Brian, over to you.
Good. So I think what we'll do is first go through the questions that have been posted in the Q&A, and then we'll have some time where if any of the speakers want to respond to some of the things that came up from the panelists and so on, as well as we encourage anybody else who'd like to add more questions into the Q&A. So we'll start with Ritu responding to Doug Mary's question, and then next would be Marguerite.
Yeah. So regarding the impact, so we have been carrying out an impact assessment. So we are still in the phase of finalizing the assessment, and So in terms of impact, what we say is that the game is actually helping in triggering a lot of discussions even in locations where it was not water is not even it's not in the public sphere. So in that way, that we find a game as a useful tool, and also a lot of other system actors like the government finds this as a useful tool in their education and training programs, as well as and some of the governments have also have been using this game as a tool for triggering discussions around water in their programs. So in that way, it has sort of impact that we see.
Good. Okay, next for Marguerite, if you have responses to Claudia Ringler's question.
Yes, I typed an answer already in the chat. But maybe before I answer the question, let me say that I always feel a bit of discomfort when there is a talk of what should we do without specifying the we. And I think the we here, perhaps in this community that is now talking, is a we of international experts on groundwater. And often the conversation becomes one of how can we international experts help those people out there manage and govern their groundwater better. And I find that deeply discomfortable. I just want to have that off my chest. So then, having said that, the question of Claudia is, I answered it. I think how can you, if you can bring the knowledge, motivation, and agency framework forward, what are specific levers to increase intrinsic motivation? Also there is a bit of a hint, a suggestion of we international experts need to push levers to increase their intrinsic motivation, which I find that discomfortable. But having shoved that out of the way, then I think what is interesting in foregrounding the care, and I don't think, in the introductory paper, care is seen as an internal motivation and economic incentives are seen as external. I'm not really sure whether that makes sense. I think care could also be an external motivation and economics could be an internal one. But basically, I think recognizing that people do care, that people are concerned about their aquifers, that they're ready to invest labor, funds, that they are ready to work together to protect, rejuvenate, recharge, whatever, it provides another entry point in engaging in joint collaborative actions to do groundwater better. And yeah, that I think, and there I have learned a lot from in India, from Aquadam, in Sopecom, in Peru, from the NGOs that we worked with. So, and I think that also doing that also requires long-term collaborations, and it requires appreciating that people indeed often do care, and sometimes if they seem to not care, it is because the political economic context in which they are operating, which is really pushing them to start growing ever more water-intensive crops. And so it's not individual greed or it's not ignorance, it's this context. So I think that is also important.
Good. Thank you very much. And then we'll switch over to the open questions in the Q&A. So the first one is from Matthew McCartney. Do games motivate citizen science, e.g. monitoring of groundwater levels? And Ritu, and then open to, Ruth or anybody else.
Yeah. So like the slide I had shown on the community responses. So in different places, the responses are different based on their water situation. So in different places, that is what we see. I mean, it leads to different things. So we also have a campaign that that our organization does, like across in 8 states in India. We also do this measuring of groundwater, where we mobilize community members, give them training on doing, and these are also in some of the villages where you use this combination of the tools. So it's not just the game, so it's a combination of the tools that we are using. So not just the games alone, but games, crop water budgeting, groundwater monitoring information, as well as the other tools that motivates people to act on the information. Yeah, so I think that's
good. Okay, thank you. And I think we only have about 5 minutes till we need to switch over to Ruth to finish up. So Ruth, if you want to say anything briefly about monitoring, or otherwise we may move on to the next question.
No, just to say that, though, I think it is important that by using the citizen science approach, if you will, that one of the things that has struck me is how FES uses the information that was collected to show people what their community has been doing, and that there's trust in that data, if you will, and in that information, because they were part of the process of collecting it. So I think that's an important complementarity. But go on with other questions.
Good. Okay. Next is Sachin T, who raised the larger agrarian context, which is something Marguerite was also mentioning. So whether there's anybody who wants to take that on. And while we're waiting, I'll say I think part of the experience of FES shows that even when there are these much bigger forces and processes, there still is some space for local action that appears. But any more comments on Sachin's question? Otherwise, I will keep this moving and go to Helen Barbosa, who has actually 2 things. One about the cumulative impact of lots of communities, which is more a response to dialogue, even if care is limited. And then asking about managed aquifer recharge. But maybe on the first point, whether Marguerite wants to say anything about, caring, but if it happens in lots of communities, or how we think about something that,
it's our plea is a much more modest one. We are not saying now care. We are not making a plea for care as a tool or as a political ideal to strive for. Of course, actually, our plea is much more to recognize the forms of caring that many people are already involved in. And those can be very contradictory. They're never innocent, never politically innocent. They're also not necessarily just, but it's just another entry point for starting to understand groundwater society or groundwater human relations.
Good. Thank you. And I'll also just mention that in terms of people concerned with broader summarizing experience on groundwater, this big exercise with not only French, but many French experts in a summary paper by Petit, where part of their key conclusion is this concern about territory. They use the word patrimony, but people's feeling of identity of a particular area is a motivation. Okay, next we have, we got 3 minutes. We have a question from Sofia Espinosa about involving state and non-state actors. And since if Alvar or Hagar want to say anything, or somebody else.
I mean, I would understand exercises as a reference to the games, perhaps. I don't know if the question is sort of leading in that direction or not. But in that case, I wouldn't know how to answer that.
Okay. Good.
I think what I can maybe attempt to say some thoughts on that. I think that's a really good question, which we've been thinking about in just like moving forward with how we do those games, like even new proposals or writing new proposals. We've been trying to, especially in places where we don't have a wonderful FES, we try to write something in the proposal that these games be embedded in something with, like, for example, a water user association or something that is like a formalized institution or like with community leaders, for example, to give it like a little bit more traction. But also perhaps thinking about how we play those games with different stakeholders and like sort of so that they all have like this understanding of each other's roles and kind of putting them in each other's shoes could be very helpful. And also changing thoughts about like the other, so like state actors thinking of farmers and vice versa. But we have not actually yet tried it, but this is kind of our direction, hopefully, moving forward.
Great comments. Before handing back to Ruth, I think, Sunil, if you have any comments about solarization or role of a media, but very quickly, just like a minute.
Yeah, I think a role of media is something, one of our, strategy that we have been using. So so we have tried to, establish links with local media actors, who can influence the local system, and also media actors at the national level. And so how, you bring this ecosystem of, bring these people in the ecosystem and, talk them about how they can, keep on, collecting stories around this and getting it published and keeping this sort of discourse alive. So I think they do have a valuable role to play in that aspect, and which is something that we have been also using. Yeah.
Okay. And I'll just make the point again with solarization, the participatory monitoring, if you start doing that from the beginning, you're helping people be aware of the challenges they may face and build up the capabilities that may be useful. And now I'll hand it back to Ruth to finish up.
Thank you all very much on this. And let me pick up one point from Mushtaq Gill's question about managed aquifer recharge. I think one of the things we didn't have time to get into that we are learning in the groundwater games is that they have induced an increase in investment in the recharge, but just increasing recharge, unless you also look at how those benefits will be shared, can be a problem. And so one of the things that the investment in the local institutions has done is makes that more sustainable. That's much easier to do in hard rock areas that are localized rather than in, for example, Punjab's large alluvial aquifers. So that's one of the issues that we are confronting. as you can tell from all of this, there's lots more questions that this raises than what we are able to answer. But I hope that this gives us an expanded set of ways of thinking about it, and even thinking about who the us is. One of the key lessons was long-term partnerships. We actually started working with FBS. I started working with them in 2005 or 6, and we started on the idea of the games in 2011. So these things don't happen overnight, and the accumulation of who all has had input to this is a really important aspect of it. Broadening out our thinking about all of this is key, I think, to being open to dealing with, as Margrethe would probably say, messy processes. But sometimes conceptual frameworks can help, at least when we see a certain behavior, thinking, oh, I wonder if that is care, or I wonder if that is motivating them. So I hope that this has given us a few more conceptual tools. I hope many of you will be induced to look at some of the papers. I hope we can continue working on how this can apply in new contexts. The NEXUS Gains initiative ends at the end of this year, so we aren't going to be working, specifically on this, but the new phase of this will take up the issue of water governance more broadly, not just groundwater. And one of the messages in this work we've done is that groundwater is not separate from surface water and other sources. So we hope you will engage with us going forward in thinking about that as well. There will be one, well, all of you who are registered will receive the PowerPoints. We would welcome you interacting with us going forward if you have further questions that we weren't able to answer. There will be one more NEXUS Gains webinar before the end of this year on, I believe, water in a warmer world. I'm not sure of the exact title, but the information on how to register will go out to everybody who was in this call, and we hope to continue to take forward many of these ideas of recognizing that even though there is not a simple solution or one size fit all. Yes, Brian. Oh, okay. I just didn't know. I thank you all, and for all of our presenters and panelists, and for all of you who have been participating in the discussion. Hope to continue this going forward. Thank you all.